Monica McNutt, Sarah Spain, Tim Calishaw, George Sedano. College. Say it with me. College. I'm not hearing the music in it. College. We've got college today. Let's go.
I'm like the Budweiser frog.
I can't wait till next week when we can do our Berman impersonation.
Oh, wow.
Georgia making the jump to the number 2 team in the country today with the new poll out, beating Clemson the way they did. Bryce Young, 4 touchdown passes in his debut as Bama rolled Miami. Notre Dame almost blowing it versus FSU, but getting away with the overtime win. And Oklahoma close versus Tulane, but they hang on. Tim Calishaw, around the horn to you. Your week 1 takeaway from the top 10.
I am not going to anoint Alabama just yet. The college season is long enough, Tony. We'll have time for that later. And by our accounts, by others' accounts, the quarterback's already got $1 million in his pocket. He doesn't need help from me. I want to talk about Georgia and that defense, because that was, you just do not see games like that unless you had 2 maybe just horribly incompetent teams that can't score. And I don't think Georgia and Clemson, I don't think that's what they represent. You don't see defense like that. The only touchdown in a 10-3 game is a pick 6. So neither offense could score, but one NFL scout said that whole Georgia defense should be at the combine basically right now. Bring them all in. They're ready to go. And I think that is a team, at some point, Alabama will have to contend with.
Sarah Spain, number 1 takeaway.
It is that game, and it's that I'm trying to look at the history of college football and the college football playoff to figure out if it's as dire as people imagine it is for Clemson. It's not, of course. We've seen historic teams, come back. We've seen starting quarterbacks go down and second quarterbacks, and then a team like Ohio State winning with their third quarterback before. It's going to be a long season for them, and they are going to have to be sharp and show incredible improvement. But I almost feel like the way this game went down, it looked so ugly that when DJU gets better and when they manage to rush for more than 2 yards, it will show that this was an aberration, and they will be able to kind of put together a whole nother season as if week 1 didn't happen. Never before have we seen a matchup this important this early, which I do think allows the committee to say, it was a week 1 thing if they look
Was it good football, Sarah Spain?
Not to watch, no.
Well, it seemed like Tim disagreed with you. Tim, you said we never before saw a game like this. We see a game like this in the Big Ten all the time, and you mock it. But when it's the SEC, it's like, whoa. When it's the ACC,
that's
whoa.
the old Big Ten.
Go ahead, Tim. Yeah, you can defend this.
No, I mean, this was like, and I'm not going to stay, like the LSU-Alabama game, whenever that was, 10 years ago. That was 9-6, that game.
2011, yeah.
This was like a starter kit for that kind of game.
We'll bring in Monica McNutt, number 1 takeaway from week 1 in the top 10.
It's Clemson for me, and I do think they're in a legitimate conundrums there. I get it. It was week 1, but you look at the rest of their schedule, they don't even play North Carolina, who actually lost this weekend. I think their biggest ACC opponent the rest of the way might be Florida State, so I'm not so sure. Now, if this Georgia squad turns out to be the juggernaut that Tim believes it's going to be, cool, but I still don't know if this group is going to run through the ACC the way that we're accustomed to seeing them do so. So I'm not so sure about their overall projection.
Legitimate conundrums is outstanding. It sounds like something Regina King would be in. I love it, Monica. George Sedano, how about you?
Tony, it's still about the haves and the have-nots in college football. Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Ohio State just on a different level. And before people push back on Ohio State, yeah, Minnesota kept it closer within striking distance, but then 2 quick scores on 1 play of over 70 yards for Ohio State. I'm going to go with Alabama, though, specifically because they just reload. They don't rebuild here. Not to mention that Nick Saban has the wayward school of football coaches there, as Bill O'Brien now all of a sudden gets to resurrect his career at Alabama, as we've seen many other coaches do. And, look at what Nick has been able to do recently with quarterbacks, something people always said, they're good on defense, they can run the ball, but they can't do anything with the quarterback position. Well, look at Tua, look at Mac, and now look at Bryce, who's probably going to be the Heisman Trophy leader heading into week 2.
Tim Calishaw.
And Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts starting this week, too. Don't leave him out.
Go ahead.
The Alabama thing is remarkable because when you look at the totals of who they send to the NFL, and LSU and Ohio State and Georgia, some of those teams are right behind them. But there's one team that keeps winning title after title after title after title.
Whether UCLA is back or LSU is going the wrong way, that's our next topic of discussion. Both, of course, could be true. But with UCLA's win over the Tigers, Ed Orgeron and the Tigers 5-6 since the national championship.
You little sissy blue shirt.
And of course, now they're giving opposing teams T-shirt ideas. You could talk about that, Sarah Spain, or you could address whether LSU is going backwards in general.
Yeah, I don't want to take anything away from UCLA. They had a really balanced attack. They won this game. They get credit for getting the W. But this is about LSU. To Tim's point, you look at a team like Bama and their ability to consistently show up year after year, even as they lose tons of players to the NFL. What we've seen from LSU is that 2019 season is looking further and further away. That maybe that 5-5 last year wasn't an aberration, that this is the kind of team that they are. This was a ugly showing from them, and it's not, as of right now, what appears to be an anomaly. It appears to be a trend for them. UCLA, I haven't seen enough of to know if this is how they're going to continue this.
Monica McNutt?
I have to separate this game a little bit from last season in my mind when you consider Hurricane Ida. And this team had to go on the road to prepare. So I'm willing to give LSU a little bit of an asterisk when it comes to that. But overall, I also think we do this thing where we use Alabama as the bar. They're really, really good. If you look back over the last 10 college football playoff victories, the only teams that have repeated are Alabama and Clemson. Ohio State's in there, Auburn's in there, and none of those teams have gotten back. I kind of think LSU is just caught in a vicious cycle.
Tim Kalishaw, when you take in last season and then this first performance, are you now joining a conversation that says LSU was just that great Joe Burrow year with Ed Orgeron?
Well, that's what separated them from all the really good LSU teams that usually had a great defense but frequently had quarterback problems. But now they have maybe some quarterback issues and a defense that's nowhere near the level they used to play at. And they weren't at that last year. And I have a hard time believing that Chip Kelly has the Bruins turned around, that they're going to score 38 on everybody that's any good. So I think LSU, besides what Monica said, that's a real thing. They had to go to Houston, and UCLA had already played a game. That hurts. But this defense doesn't look anything like an LSU defense.
George Sedano?
Tony, let me address real quick the Ida situation, which Monica brought up, which makes a ton of sense. However, there are real-world problems with LSU's defense, including giving up 14 plays of 50 yards or more over the last season and now this season after this game against UCLA. Now, allow me to go full Plaschke on you right here.
Nobody ever goes full Plaschke and lives this.
Let me go full Plaschke on you. So with UCLA, we're talking about a team that, let's face it, nobody here in LA tends to care about when it comes to football. Basketball, we love UCLA. Everyone's on the UCLA bandwagon outside of the USC faithful. It's not the case when it comes to football. Chip Kelly came in with a lot of fanfare, didn't get the job done early, but here's what he's done. He's established an offensive line. And if you can control the line of scrimmage in college football, and football in general, but specifically college football, you can then control the game. And that's what he's done. He's simplified the game. He's allowed Dorian Thompson-Robinson to be able to flourish, not only in the run game, but allow him to make those big plays down the field. And shout out to it, the AD, Martin Jarman, who since the second he stepped foot on Westwood has not only had the basketball team in the Final Four, but now has the football team headed in the right direction.
He's giving shout outs. He's talking about how Chip Kelly has adapted to simplify the game when the knock on Chip Kelly all along was it was too complicated. Did Sedano just survive going full Plaschke here and making this about UCLA? Sarah, you're shaking your head no.
No, that was a FaceTime, but I appreciate you giving him the time to go ahead and do that. I thought he was going to make the very valid point to Monica that, yes, of course, we can't take out the effects of Hurricane Ida, but Tulane almost had a huge upset. They were also, put onto a home game that was actually away. So not to compare traumas and their reactions, but I don't know if that's going to last.
And to compare colors and shades of blue.
Right.
Is there anything here with Ed Orgeron, Monica?
Sissy is like super outdated, and obviously it's a dig at women, so that's super lame. Go with Carolina blue if you want to insult UCLA.
Oh, that they stole Carolina's blue. Tim, anything here?
I'm not sure about the color scheme, but I thought Sedano / Plaschke / Bill Walton made one valid point, and that's that UCLA might be ready to compete in the weakest of the 5 Power 5 conferences.
Wait a second. Wait a second. Wait a second.
No, there's no way to second.
The SEC.
There's no way to second.
The SEC doesn't travel out west very often. When they do, it hasn't been good, and we saw that.
Well, I mean, once again, Kalisha, if the Pac-12 plays a 10-3 game, he's braining down all type of mutes. If the SEC does it, it's a novella. It's the greatest thing I've ever seen. One more thing here. The targeting rule. I want to talk about this. It's always been a mystery, but last night there were 4 ejections in the first half of Louisville-Ole Miss. George, are we closer or further from having this figured out to protect players and to fairly officiate games?
Tony, I would say we're closer, although I do think because of the subjectivity of this, it's very difficult. Here's what I would say. There needs to be grades to this, right? Different degrees to this, like anything in life. And ultimately, you need to give the defender a chance. If he's already left his feet and the runner or someone then lowers his head, there's no way they can change in midair. Like, that needs to be something that's addressed too.
I think maybe this was the best thing to happen to college football last night because there were no other games on. So powerful coaches, administrators watch this farce of seeing 4 players ejected in the first half and say it's time to make it a second penalty.
Sarah Spain?
Yeah, I think they're closer. I think the more recent rule change where you couldn't just have a call on the field stand, you had to confirm and approve that it was a targeting was the right move. So it can't be something that hasn't been looked at closely enough. But I agree with Tim. I think in certain cases it should be a severe penalty before an ejection. That feels like too much for such a subjective call.
Monica, nut.
Yeah, Tim's nailing it in terms of the procedures that are worthy of changing. But I also think that you've got to give these athletes some credit. I think the rule came in an era in which you were technically taught and trained to do this in a way that is now deemed illegal. We're dealing with the new generation of athletes. Now, those guys want to be on the field just as much as anybody.
Monica, I know this is your 10th or 15th show, but you really love giving the credit to a previous panelist. I like this new generation. I appreciate that because there are certain errors of around the horn where nobody would acknowledge when someone else is correct. Taking a break right here, buy or sell on the other side. Sedano survives going full Plashke. It's been a U.S. Open unlike any other. It's been about who's not playing, about who's gone out early, and look at this headline in the New York Times. Why does playing tennis make so many pros miserable? Naomi Osaka taking an indefinite break from tennis as she struggles to find meaning and joy from playing. It's sadly familiar script for the sport, the Times writes. Shelby Rogers talked about the $9 million death threats she was going to receive for losing. Sloane Stevens' abusive messages were tracked, and they were at 2,000 after her performance. Sarah, how do you hear all that?
Well, for one, as someone who has to go through this as a woman in sports, that you get a thicker skin the more you're in the business. But if you're an athlete who happens upon public conscience because you have a great outing or a great match, it's going to be really difficult for you to all of a sudden have this onslaught of negative attention. It's easy to say ignore it. It's easy to say don't log in. But that's from our generation who knew what it was like before. This is the currency for people of their age. This is a constant interaction. And to find that balance of how to take in the positive and the negative and to use it as a promotional tool and to build your brand while also not falling under the weight of all of it, it's really difficult. I wish we could fix society from not being terrible people who attack athletes for a loss, but that's a much bigger dilemma than just figuring out how to handle it individually.
And just to follow up, those that would say, well, sports is about the mental toughness to get through distractions on the periphery and all that. You believe in tennis it's different?
Well, I think in tennis in particular, as someone who played sports like basketball, where you can get out there and throw an elbow when you're rebounding or try to physically push your way through it, you're not sitting down at a Lily White country club setting with people who have mics in your face asking you individually alone why you failed when expectations were so high. It feels very different to me.
Monica?
I mean, I applaud these athletes for speaking up because I think the more you just ignore it, you normalize it, and the behavior still isn't acceptable. Is it par for the course? Sure. But the other thing that rings out in this particular situation is these are 3 women in particular, 2 women of color. I can only imagine some of the vitriol that they received, especially when you think of the way society in general still has issues understanding what a woman's right actually is.
George Sedano, you read the New York Times piece. You've been covering, tennis in the past. Do you believe tennis is different?
I do believe it's different. Look, Sarah basically nailed it, right? Like, there's a lot of pressure on an individual person. Golf is very similar in this way as well, right? Where you're there by yourself. There's no one out there. There's no other teammate. You can't sit here and make the case that someone else was the reason that a play broke down or whatnot. It is you and only you. And I do think that it just boils down to people are jerks, man. Like, why do we need to be such jerks, right? Sarah said, do we need to improve society? Yes. Like, common decency, man. Like, these people would never say this. The majority of them would never say this to anyone's face. The fact that they do it and hide behind the anonymity of social media is disgusting to me.
Tim Kalisha.
Here's what I would say, and I recognize that my situation and negative feedback is very different from what a woman might receive in social media. But after 12 years on Twitter, what that basically is, or Instagram, is you're saying, here's my home phone number. I don't have caller ID. Tell me what you think of me. And I will read or I will listen to these messages. Something you would never do in real life. And you have to learn to just, especially for a tennis player who's just lost a match where they know they're going to be criticized, just walk away. You don't need to read all the criticism. You don't need to read all your notifications on Twitter.
Now it's not just walk away. Osaka is talking about walking away from the sport for an indefinite time period.
Yeah,
and it's arrived at that.
And I think we recognize that her situation is a little different, and that gets to the whole trying to be number one in a sport and then trying to maintain being number one and the incredible pressure that Matthew Futterman talked about in the New York Times article.
And George?
Tony, I'd just like to add the tabloid nature also of tennis, particularly overseas, right? Where we see some of these tournaments, particularly Wimbledon, becomes one of those tournaments where a lot of these papers and rags become tabloids in a lot of ways. I do think that stuff affects it. The social media just amplifies that stuff even more.
Monica, I want to bring you back in here. You said something before we sat down that was very intriguing to me, and it's hard for anyone to grasp. It's the most nebulous thing in all this. We talk about mental health here, but we're talking about mental health in somebody's being in the field of play, right? And there are different things about somebody who's mental health away from tennis, but also on the court and the pressures. Please expand.
Well, I just have been thinking so much of Naomi Osaka, who has to be one of the most emotive athletes in such a bright spotlight I think we've seen in a long time. And so she's been willing to say, I need to step away to address my mental health. But I don't think that we should be disillusioned with the idea that just because someone pushes through some of this hatred and is performing, there are still not mental health things that need to be adjusted. So we have to take an all-encompassing look when we have the conversation about mental health.
When Naomi Osaka said she wanted to have the conversation about mental health, and she opened herself up on that, I don't think that was free reign for everybody to, from the cheap seats, make a judgment on it. And that's the toughest thing, I think, throughout all this, right? She put herself out there so publicly, and it was in real time. And it's going to have to require work. It doesn't just get better with time. It gets better with time and work. And everyone putting their own judgment of it all from the cheap seats is not helping that. That's for sure.
Not at all.
Tim Kalishaw, thank you for your thoughts today. Sarah Spain as well. Monica McNutt, George Sedano. Showdown, 2 minutes.